Hi everyone. Today we are taking a look at the English Civil War, but just a quick couple of housekeeping notes along the way here. Um, if you have questions about the SAQs, let me know. We'll talk about those more later on this week. Same thing goes for witchcraft in Europe. If you have questions about the activity from the other day, let me know. The English Civil War is really a battle of absolutism versus constitutionalism. Who is in charge within the government? And again, we're talking England here, 1640s, 1650s. This issue is going to be the main crux of the English Civil War and the conflict that happens. Um, it's absolute power for the king versus limited power. Does the government, does the parliament, do the people have the right to limit the power that the monarch has? And this is all kind of born out of the Magna Carta. Magna Carta is 1215. During medieval Europe, we have King John, who is taxing the people heavily in order to fight some losing wars in France. This actually is one of the um, time periods that causes the 100 Years' War. We're way far away from it at this point, but the lands are in France, and England and France are fighting over who is in control of those lands. So it's King John, and King John is not well liked by everybody, and so the nobles actually force him to sign the Magna Carta in 1215 at Runnymede in order to limit his power. The Probably the biggest thing that comes out of this is that you cannot tax the people, especially tax them heavily, without their consent. In this case, we're talking about Parliament, that the monarch can't tax the people unless Parliament gives its consent. And this is the way that England's going to be from here on out, where the king will have to talk to Parliament. Um, the people have to give their consent to Parliament in order to allow this to happen. So the sovereignty in constitutionalism, which is England, is going to rest with the people, specifically the nobles, versus the monarch. Charles I is the King of England during this time period, and he says democracy is the power of equal votes for unequal minds. The idea that not everybody is or should be able to take part in government. Some people just aren't cut out for it. And that's why the idea of Charles I, that he is the one who's in control, is going to be pretty easily seen here. Again, we're talking absolutism, and a big part of that is divine right to rule, the ability of the kings to rule because God said so. So for Charles, God is telling him that he is able to rule. Therefore, nobody else should have the right to check his power. Nobody else should have the right to limit his power because they are not given that right through divinity. The English Civil War takes course over the time period 1642 to 1651, sort of, but we have to kind of go into the causes and effects much more so than the actual fighting that takes place. And that's a common theme throughout this year. Charles I, he's able to keep England out of the 30 Years' War. 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648. That war is going to engulf much of Europe, but he's able to stay out. And that's a big deal for England because it's able to build its wealth up. The problem is for Charles, Charles doesn't want Parliament to have any sort of authority in England. And so he dissolves Parliament. Um, a quick note, when we say Parliament, what that means is the meeting of two houses, two groups, the House of Lords and the House of Commons. It's a bicameral legislature. And when we say dissolves Parliament, all that means is he says, okay, go away, I don't need you at this time. For Parliament to take place, think of it as like a congressional session where Congress is in session discussing issues for the people. He dissolves Parliament and resorts to kind of a cheater way to get money. England obviously is a part of the Isle of Great Britain, and that means that they would be susceptible to a naval attack. In order to protect people from that and not have to ask Parliament for money, Charles continues a practice known as ship money. In theory, the idea is that the coastal towns will pay for the upkeep of the navy in order to make sure that they aren't invaded. But Charles takes it a couple of steps further than that and taxes basically everybody. It's not, now, careful, sorry, it's not a tax. It's a collection of money. And he throws people in jail who refuse to pay and that sort of thing. People don't like this. Now, legally, it holds up, but it's one of those things where he loses in the court of public opinion. People really come after him because of this, and it's kind of shady dealings. In addition to that, he has married a Catholic woman, Mary Anna, and as a result of this, there's this undercurrent that people think that maybe there's this bigger conspiracy where Charles is going to turn England back into a Catholic empire, and that really frightens the Protestants of England, and they're going to work their hardest to make sure that that doesn't happen. While all of that's going on, we have the Bishops' Wars in 1639 and 1640. So we have some bishops up here in Scotland, and they are going to come down and attack. And the reason is it really has to do with religion. These Scottish Presbyterians, they don't want any part of Charles I trying to give leniency or trying to convert people to Catholicism. And for Charles, unfortunately for him, he doesn't have enough of a strong army in order to defend it. And part of that is because he can't pay them because he refuses to ask Parliament for money. That leads to kind of an embarrassing item that he has to sign called the Parliament Triennial Act of 1641. This Triennial Act is, Charles signs it, and this limits his power by saying, okay, it's been 10 years since Charles has called any sort of parliament to get anything done. And the Triennial Act states that if within 3 years a parliament is not called, the parliament has the ability to call itself, basically, for a 10-month period. Parliament has to meet for 10 months over a 3-year period. This is a way to try and ensure that these monarchs are not grabbing as much power as Charles I has. Then we have some problems going on over here in Ireland. And so this is going on in England here, Scotland in the north, and Ireland. And all of this together, really the English Civil War, a better name for it, which is kind of used to some degree, is the War of the Three Kingdoms, England, Scotland, and Ireland. And it's because all three of them play a role in what happens here. We had some Protestant landowners from Scotland make their way over here to Northern Ireland, and that was in an effort to limit Catholicism there on Ireland. Obviously, the Irish don't take kindly to that, and we have the Ulster Rebellion in 1641. This part of the Isle of Ireland is Ulster, and that's going to be where the major fighting takes place, even up through the 1900s in the time period known as the Troubles between Catholics and Protestants. All of that is going on, and so finally, Charles I has to call a parliament. It doesn't really work. He dissolves it again. It's known as the Short Parliament for that reason. And so Parliament is still really upset with Charles. Charles kind of shoots himself in the foot. If he just acquiesces to some of their demands, this whole situation is probably over. So the English Civil War really kind of begins with the Grand Remonstrance. This is as a result of the dissolution of Parliament. And the Grand Remonstrance that you see up here in the upper right-hand corner is really just a list of things that Parliament thinks that Charles is terrible at and has been terrible at dealing with since the time that Charles took over. And so it's kind of like just an I hate you letter with all of the things and all of the reasons why Parliament hates him. But the bottom line is that battle lines have kind of been drawn at this point. This actually divides up Parliament. It only passes by a small margin in order to be this official decree. And some of the people think, all right, listen, maybe we have gone too far in this in calling out Charles the way that we are. So you have two camps. The first camp is the group who wants to pass the Grand Remonstrance and does, the parliamentarians, and they will eventually become known as the Roundheads in honor of their short haircuts, meaning that they're not totally aristocratic in some way. And then on the other side, you have the people who support the king, the royalists, and they eventually become known as Cavaliers. And that's both of these are kind of negative ways. It's the opposing sides calling them these things. Cavaliers for their attitude and how they deal with everybody else, and so it's kind of a negative on them. But the red areas are royalist territories, and the blue areas here are the parliamentarian territories prior to the actual fighting beginning. So we see some skirmishes and some things like that. We're not going to get into the battles. You really don't need to know anything of them, except for the fact that Charles really kind of stinks as a military leader. The purpose of this fighting, it's about absolutism versus parliamentary demands, constitutionalism. It's important to note that people don't want to get rid of the king. They're not trying to execute the king. They're not trying to overthrow him and instill some new kind of government. They just want the king to pay attention and limit his power so that he can't keep doing what he's doing. Religion is going to play a role in this. As I mentioned, England at this point is Protestant, and the Puritans are a separate sect of Protestantism within England during this time period. And the Puritans are like a stricter group within Protestantism. A quote that kind of helps to get us there, if only in a sarcastic way, is H.L. Mencken, who says that Puritanism is really the sense of foreboding that somebody somewhere might be happy. And it gives you an idea in terms of how strict they are, how straight-laced they are. The parliamentarians, the Roundheads, they ally themselves with Scotland, and they're able to do that because of religion. by trying to feed this fire of discontent that people think that Charles I is going to convert everybody to Catholicism. And that helps them to gain in numbers. And one of the leaders of the parliamentarians is Oliver Cromwell, and he really shows himself to be a master tactician and leader of men. Eventually, he helps to defeat the royalists in the north, and Charles himself is actually captured in 1646. And you think, okay, this is the end. Either they're going to kill him, or they're going to say, okay, Charles, you have to obey what we say here in Parliament. But that's not what happens. Because the New Model Army, which is predominantly in terms of leadership Puritan, and the Parliament are at ends. Parliament just kind of wants Charles to say, okay, yeah, my bad, and move on. The New Model Army wants to put him on trial. Oliver Cromwell, he gets painted as a bad guy a lot throughout history, but I think there's more gray area than that. There's a lot of evidence that says that he's really just trying to keep everybody together and try and smooth out some of these differences that they have. Charles escapes, which don't worry about how. He escapes to the Isle of Wight, makes his way to the northern part of England, allies himself with Scotland by saying, oh, hey, Presbyterian Scotland, I'll agree to your demands. And so then eventually we have the Second Civil War, kind of, whatever. New divisions, new motivations within the Roundhead regime, leading to the Rump Parliament, where basically a small group of Puritan-based leaders in Parliament say, okay, anybody who's not on board with completely getting rid of Charles I, you're out. And so they have their own mini parliament. And this Rump Parliament is going to last for quite a long time. Charles is captured again in 1648 and then is executed in 1649. His head is chopped off. This is a big deal. It's a regicide. It's the killing, the murder of a king. And Oliver Cromwell is named Lord Protector. He's not a king, it's important to note, but he is going to use this newfound power to conquer some of the Catholics in Ireland. Eventually, a quarter of them are going to die by some estimates, thanks to the war and famine. And eventually we see Charles II, Charles I's son, who had fled to France, become a part of the Third Civil War. He actually had some experience fighting in the 30 Years' War, and so you'd think, oh, okay, maybe he will be a leader of men also. He also loses to Oliver Cromwell and his men. Again, we don't need to get bogged down in the details. And he makes his way over to France. Results. Oliver Cromwell gets painted as this kind of demon in history, wanting to overthrow a king and instill himself as dictator. To be perfectly honest with you, based on the written evidence from the time period, I think that's a bit of a misnomer. I think that he was really just trying to keep England together as much as he could. I'm not saying he's totally complicit in everything. I'm not saying he's innocent of everything. He's definitely complicit. But we have these different sects emerge due to differences within Parliament, due to differences with the different religious sects. The Puritans, eventually, this is the group that is saying peace and making their way out to New England via the Mayflower a few years prior to this. So you can see that we're starting to see some more division within England. In addition, we eventually have the restoration of the monarchy in 1660. That's not going to go super awesome, and it's going to lead to the Glorious Revolution of 1688 with William and Mary. And again, we have this concept of absolutism versus constitutionalism. Who is in charge? In England, it's really the strength is within constitutionalism. There's a limit to the power of the monarch. In other places like eventually Prussia, Russia, and France, we're going to see absolutism play a much, much bigger role. And that's where we'll stop off here for today. Let me know if you have questions, as always, and have a great day.